All right, so this is the first time I've given this talk, so if I slow down, if I back up, if I make a mistake in here and correct myself, please bear with me. I'm usually pretty good at handling a talk first time, but this one's a little different than some of the ones I've done. I'm making an assumption as I start this talk that those of you out there have some experience with regex. In particular with this talk, I'm looking at regex in JavaScript. If I were in a face-to-face meetup environment, if we had the larger portion of our group with their cameras on, that kind of stuff, I'd have people put up hands saying how many of you are familiar with regex, how many of you consider yourselves gurus or experts at regex, and watch all the hands drop down. Tonight I'm just going to assume some experience, okay? And while I say that, what I want to point out is that this talk is not for myself as a regex expert or guru or whatever you want to call it. I'm good at regex and I can probably help with a few things. But I ran into a pattern a few years ago and I wrote a paper on it and published that somewhere along the way. And somebody found it about a year ago and indicated that it might make an interesting open source project. And that's where the project that this talk is based on came from, okay? So having said all that, first thing, I'm not an expert at regex. I'm very good at it, and I have a lot of resources from folks that are equally as good in various parts of regex that I can usually figure it out. I can hack some things through. I am a full-time developer with Leading EDJE out of Dublin, Ohio, just northwest of Columbus. Been with them now just over 4 years. And I work with various clients through Leading EDJE. One of those a few years back was chemical abstracts, okay? And that's where the whole basis of this began, okay? All right, so what is regex? Regex, regular expressions, okay? Basically building patterns, specifying a set of strings for a particular purpose, being able to take strings, whether they're multi-line, single line, all caps, mixed case, whatever, being able to define a search pattern, okay? Provide, and I say this lightly, provide a concise and flexible mean for identifying strings of interest, particular characters, particular words, patterns of characters. And I say that lightly, concise and flexible, because it is very concise. As those of you that have worked with it know, it's also can be extremely difficult to figure out what you were doing, especially you go back and look at code you wrote 6 months ago, or you look at code that somebody else wrote and you're trying to figure out what that regex expression does. It's kind of a pain. And with that particular project with chemical abstracts, and I'll get into that a little deeper, wound up writing several hundred regex for various purposes. And this moved forward. I've used all of these sites before. Regex 101 tends to be my site of choice. And when you see the way I document some of my regex, and if you're familiar with Regex 101 and how its descriptions show up on the right side, you might get an idea of where some of my documentation skills came from, because I like what I see on their site. Now, this is fairly short list of the ones that I've used. I keep the sites that I use fairly frequently bookmarked, so this is pretty pared down. If you've got something better than one of these, please let me know. Absolutely willing to take a look at what somebody's got out there and try it out. So, project originated with chemical abstracts. I can't go into too much detail because it is a client, it is their code, but essentially what I did there was I wrote a script engine parser. Okay, I actually wrote the entire script engine. It ran a scripting language that had been developed by their company upwards of 30 years ago on a mainframe system that clients would be able to run scripts and search data in their text terminal-based system and search that data with it. Well, those scripts are still out there, and we had to write a script engine, a parser that would run in the browser because we were shifting that entire system into a browser. And if any of you have written a script engine and a parser, one of the things that you first jump to is, hey, I can use regex. I need to find out where this command word is and what the parameters are after it. And first thing I found out in the very first iteration of this project was that regex in and of itself is very slow. We took a 10-line script that was a baseline script to give me an idea of how my engine would work, how my parser would work. And it took over 5 minutes to parse. Essentially what I had been doing was I was looping through all of my regex patterns for all of the commands, and I was executing that against each line. And when I found the right one, then I would parse that command out and build it up in such a way that the engine could then take it and run it. And I learned very, very quickly how slow regex is. We supplemented a little bit there, nothing too complicated, but we did some string validation, looking for, at least that command word before we looked at the options. Is it on this line? And then I can run that against the narrowed down set of regex. And we got it down fairly quick from that point. Now, what I also learned through this in the refactoring was that when you've got a lot of regex, being able to read and understand what's going on in those is critical. And in this particular project that I'm going to show you did not come out of what I did at Chemical Abstracts. I actually wound up with a service that had a ton of comments. I mean, so I'd have one function that would build a regex just for things like they defined a chunk of code by a begin and an end that would be on an individual line. Okay, it's a very simple example. And I built a function that would just look for a particular string that was in and of itself the only thing on that line, that was always in caps. That it wound up being one of the simplest regex that we ran within the system. But I had to document that function. I had to document each location where I turned that function into something that we could then utilize later in the system. And there probably was about 3 or 4 times the documentation that we had lines of code in this particular service. And this frustrated me, okay? Regex is hard to read. It's hard to understand what you're looking at. And what I wanted to do was find a way to flip that on its head, okay? And it was about that time that I started looking into different ways to build a regex, different ways to essentially create those strings, create ready objects. And what I wound up with, after all was said and done, after I wrote that article, I posted it out there, somebody a year later commented on it and said, hey, this will be a great project. And they were right. Because what I essentially had done was taken a template literal. Those of you who don't know what I'm talking about there, template literal is where you use the backticks and you can do multi-lines, and it doesn't do any string interpolation, nothing in there where it's, you don't have to put a /n in or anything like that. It literally shows what's in that template. And what I was able to do then was take that simple regex that usually is a little one-liner that's can be a little difficult to figure out what's going on, put it into a template literal, put the comments right there in the template literal itself. And I did this really simply. I used the JavaScript comments, so the // and the /* or / pattern, and then anywhere I saw that in there, I took it out. Any spaces I had in there, I took it out, allowing me to do I call this regidoc. So in this case, regicreate, regigenerate, to create those objects. Okay, I am gonna bring up the GitHub if we have time at the end to show you the site. But this then became the basis for my open source project. So show you a little bit of how this works, okay? This is a real simple example I'm starting with here. If you look on the top left there, you've got the const code, code 1. If you look at the right side, this is what Regex Regex 101 gives me. Okay, so this is all about the capturing groups and everything that's in there. And if we look at this, I've read enough regex along the way that, you know, I can see the caret where it's the beginning of the line. I can see the $sign at the end of the line. I've got a couple of square bracketed /s stars, so it's essentially it's capturing spaces there to some degree. And then I've got a group in the center with a dot, which tells me any character, a star that tells me any number of characters could be down to 0, a question mark, which I think, if I remember right, I have to go look here, lazy or something like that, and how it captures. But we can look up how that occurs on the right side there, what comes up on Regex 101, and figure that out. Okay. Now that whole thing of running through that in my head, you know, I've looked at thousands of regex expressions over the years, and very rarely are they this simple. In fact, they're very complicated generally. What this one does is it removes these spaces before and after, gives you capturing groups that can allow you to grab the string with those spaces removed. Nothing more complicated than that. And I do have this regex saved. The link's down there at the bottom if you want to take a peek at it. But what I'm able to do with the Regidocs, with the open source project that I created, is take this in a different direction. Okay, so here up at the top, you can see that I required Regidocs. You can import Regidocs any way you want. I newed it up, so I've got Regi in lowercase. I created the string here. I commented up at the top there so you can see the original regex and how it looks, and you can see how I broke things up. So I've got the caret, I've got the $sign, the beginning of the line, the end of the line. You can see where the 0 more white space is duplicated now. Wrapped around that any character, 0 to unlimited lazy, as few times as possible, expanding as needed. This now becomes something that's much easier to figure out what's going on. And I don't know about you, one of the things that I noticed really quickly as I use this Regidocs a little more frequently, it's a lot easier for me to parse out what's going on in that regex in my head when it's broken up like this on the multiple lines into multiple simple segments. Okay, you can see down at the bottom where I created a test pattern. I did a regi create. You could do the regi create, you could do the regi generate. Either way, you could pass them in as a function. Later on, I used tagging the template literals as well, so both options are in there, and I'll show an example of that here in a minute. And then we got a result that we execute against that pattern, and we look at what's in that string when we execute that, which is the test spaces before and after, which is what was in our pattern, with the actual blank spaces at the beginning and the end removed. Okay. Again, not real concerned about the actual execution and testing of it. I mean, I have the testing built into the open source project. What I really want to get you to start to see is the readability of what we're able to do with Regidocs, as opposed to the standard reading that single line of regex or the multiple lines of comments that have to go with it to explain what's going on, especially if it's more complicated. Okay, so here, these create, if you notice up here by the code 1 on the second line down where we got the regi.create, I bolded it so it's a little easier to see. And I'm using that template tagging. Okay, the only difference with the template tagging here is you can't pass in things at this point like global or case insensitive and that kind of thing. So the slash and the text after it, you can't pass those in using this tagging pattern. But it's another way to do it. It's another way to make things a little bit simpler. And then we can do a generate as well. So the generate actually creates the regex, whereas in that previous one, if I go back a slide here real quick, the create actually did not generate something that's functional. It created the actual string that would generate something functional at that point. Whereas here we're generating that object. And okay, so then Regidocs has basically 4 patterns in it. Okay, two major categories. We've got the create and we've got the generate. Create returns that regex ready string that you can execute. So just with any other regex with JavaScript, where you pass it a string, that's what we're doing here. We're creating that string, but we're creating that string that's something that then becomes readable. And here we have the generate, and if you use the generate as a function, you can pass in those flags. If you're creating a template literal, there is a default set of flags that we use, and I've created a set flags so that you can actually set flags before you use those tagged options. So you can set the flag kind of in a global state or change and adjust it as needed as you're utilizing it through. Now, at this point, I'd like to point out that one of the first questions I got when I started up this open source project was, why would you want to make your code slower? Because if you remember me saying, executing regex, they're slow. With this pattern, you're going to slow things down more. Okay, but really, the regedocs itself, when it generates that string, when it generates that object, creates the string, generates the object, while that is slowing your code down, it's not slowing it down to the level that actually executing a regex expression would. Okay, and one of the things that I'm working towards, one of the next features that I want to be able to build is have compiler level versions of regedocs where you can go through, look for the regi creates, the regi generates, and replace those with the strings or with the regex objects. Haven't gotten to that point yet. It's a little more complicated to do that. Has to be done for multiple types of build systems, but I'm working that direction. Okay, that's the next generation of what's coming out here. And I had to respond to that individual that asked that question about slowing my code down even further. And the reality is, what I would want is a service where, as I spin it up, yes, I spend some time building all these regex expressions that are created, that or generated, setting them up, getting things in place, and being a service, hopefully a singleton that only executes the one time and set up and it's ready to go. Yes, it does take a little time to get that setup done, but at the same time, on the back end, I don't write code generally to be the fastest code ever. I write code so that the next person, whether it's one of you guys a couple months later or myself 6 months down the road coming back to look at the code, I write it for those people. I need it to be readable. And regedocs is one of those tools that I now use to make it readable for the next person. Okay. So as I take a look at another example, I look at this piece up here that has something in there that's an area, which I was not something I use in my regex a lot. And I notice it's a group within a group in there as well. And we got a digit of 3. Okay, so I see area, and I'm thinking area code when you got 3 and you got a dash. We got slash digit 2, which in this case didn't make any sense to me. Because that wouldn't be a phone number. So maybe if it's 3 and 2, and we'll look, we see the next one's 4. So that's probably a social security number. An area has something to do with the area that social security number came from. Guessing, okay? And you can see all of what Regex 101 generated. I mean, there's a lot going on here, a lot of things happening. We've got a named capture group. We've got all of this going on, okay? And to someone that's a casual user of Regex, this one might be a bit difficult, okay? But we can turn it into something like this. Okay, we've got a beginning line, end line. We've got a group. There we go. We got a named group. It's named area. We got the end of the named group. I broke that up, separated there. 3 digits. We got a literal dash in there twice. We've got a 2-digit space in there. We've got a 4-digit space in there. This becomes much easier to figure out what's going on. It's a much simpler pattern to then understand. Okay, and I showed a couple of use cases of this, and this documentation's in a part of the GitHub repo as well. Okay. In my mind, this is significantly easier to read and understand than the single line. And that was the ultimate goal. Okay. So as we move forward, here's another example. Yes, I put lots of examples in because I didn't know how long this thing was going to take, and I'm running really fast. We're going to have lots of time for questions. Something a little more interesting here. So I got a V with a question mark. Okay, so that V is optional, I'm guessing. You know, I know the answers to these, but this is how my brain goes through them. Slash digit with a plus sign. Okay, so it could be any number of digits. And then I got a backslash period. So it's a literal period, I think. Now we got another /d plus, so digit. Oh, well, look, we got another slash period and another digit. So first thing that comes to mind when I see V and digits and periods and digits and periods is this is something related to versioning, most likely. Okay. But if we break it up this way, and we look at a regenerate, that we have the beginning line, end line, we're grouped, large scale group. Version, optional, any digit can be at least, has to be at least one. A period character, any digit, at least one. A period character, any digit, at least one. Hey, that sounds much more like a version control system of some sort, and certainly much easier to figure out what's happening when you look at that, in my mind, and looking at that vertically like that, okay? So, Regex, okay, takes the template literal, removes comments, generates either, using either pattern, the create or the generate, to create the string or to create the object, okay? Specifically designed, this project is specifically designed to prove readability of regex within JavaScript. And as I said, previous questions that I've had on this project, does it add to the amount of code that needs to be run? Regex is already so. Yes, it does. Okay, in fact, quite simply, if we look at an example like this, you know, this one line of code up at the top now becomes multiple lines of code. It's longer on the order of a factor of about 5 or 6, right? Which is going to take longer to run. And we've got to parse some things out, and it gets, essentially it gets jammed down into that string that, or that regex that you see up at the top there. So yes, it is more. But I think in terms of readability, it's absolutely worth the cost. Okay, and can this code be used to build in a build process to generate minified code, scrambled code, whatever you want to call it? Yes, it can be used. I haven't written the tooling for that quite yet, but it's coming. Okay, so the GitHub site, the next slide I've got is for questions and things like that, but I'm going to hop down here real quick and show you the Regex site real quick. Oh, did I just lose the share? I think I did. Hang on. Oh no, I still got the share. Okay, good. I'll make sure I didn't lose the share, didn't lose everything we're doing there. Okay, so this is Regex. Okay, it's bob-fornal/Regex, nothing too complicated. And it's versioned. Yes, I've found a couple of bugs and things here. Here's the set flag I was talking about that you could use if you're using the tagged template literals. Okay. The create, it takes a template literal. Here's the create with a tagged template literal. There's the generate. Since we're generating a function here, we can pass the flags in. Here with the tagged template literal, again, we'd have to use a set flag there. These examples are really, really close to what I used in the slide deck, so I'm not going to waste a lot of time looking at those. Documentation, some of the things that I've done here, and to do. Okay, way to use it in the build process. I'm continuously improving the logic, and I want to add in some error handling, which I haven't done yet as well. But there are unit tests against all of this as well. Okay. So having done all that, let me come back over here and get back into the presentation. And oh, where'd my presenter? Oh wow. Okay. It went back in a weird way, so I'm going to just cheat and come down here because this is where we're at. Questions and answers. And yeah, that was a lot faster than I expected it to be. I've got to either add more slides or slow down quite a bit.